Good afternoon and welcome to the Center for American Progress. I'm Rudy deLeon, the Senior Vice President for National Security Programs. A central element of our national security program at the Center is Middle East Progress, our initiative to develop and highlight practical approaches and voices to manage and resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict and broaden the understanding of U.S. interests in the Middle East and the most effective means for their pursuit. CAP produces the Middle East Bulletin. It's published to an influential audience across the United States and throughout the Middle East. The Bulletin provides a crucial platform through which to identify and amplify the views of Americans, Arabs, and Israelis seeking pragmatic solutions and a secure peace. We are joined by the Acting Director of Middle East Progress, Moran Banai, and Ian Bomberg, an editor of the Bulletin, our colleagues here at CAP. On our program today are three guests who will be speaking about the multiple challenges Jerusalem poses to any resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian and broader Arab-Israeli conflict. They'll be introduced in more detail in a moment, but first, Ambassador Michael Bell is co-director of the Jerusalem Old City Initiative at the University of Windsor, a Canadian diplomat who has served in the region. Marshall Berger, a professor of law at the Columbus School of Law at the Catholic University of America, and a co-author of Jerusalem's Holy Places and the Peace Process. And our moderator, Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer, the S. Daniel Abraham Professor in Middle East Policy Studies at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School and a former U.S. ambassador to Israel and Egypt. These three speakers bring with them unique knowledge and expertise about the Arab-Israeli peacemaking and Jerusalem. It's fitting that we should be here discussing Jerusalem at the same time President Obama is visiting Riyadh and Cairo as part of his effort to bring new urgency to resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict and to begin a new chapter on U.S. relations with the Muslim world. In his first 3 months in office, President Obama has shown that his administration intends to engage deeply in resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict. The president appointed Senator George Mitchell as a special envoy for the Middle East peace process in his first week in office and has already held high-level meetings with many of our allies in the region. In just the past few weeks, the King of Jordan, President of Israel, Prime Minister of Israel, and President of the Palestinian Authority have all visited Washington. Today, President Obama is meeting King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, and tomorrow he will speak at Cairo University and meet with President Mubarak. During these meetings, as well as in Senator Mitchell's trips to the region, the administration has signaled that it will take a comprehensive approach to resolving the tensions in the region. It will build on past peace efforts as well as the Arab Peace Initiative and work toward the realization of a two-state solution, resulting in Israeli and Palestinian states living side by side in security and peace and the normalization of relations between Israel and the Arab world. Since launching the Middle East Progress 2 years ago, the Center has been talking about just such an approach. We've been looking at the region in an integrated manner and asking, what are the challenges and how might addressing all of these and each challenge make the others easier for resolution? Through the Middle East Bulletin, events such as this one, and work on innovative public-private partnerships to strengthen the Palestinian economy, we have been advocating not only a comprehensive regional approach, but also an approach that brings together on-the-ground economic and security progress with the meeting of obligations by both sides and real and serious progress on negotiations. Today we have three top experts who will bring practical discussion to resolving the question of Jerusalem. I'm happy now to yield to Ambassador Kurtzer, who will be moderating the session. Ambassador, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's good to be back in Washington and to see so many friends. If I smile at you and you don't remember ever meeting me, I'm probably smiling at the person behind you. So excuse that. As Rudy suggested, and as you know, what has brought you here today of all the issues in the Arab-Israeli conflict, certainly one of the most complex, perplexing, and sensitive has to do with the question of Jerusalem and its disposition in the final status agreement. There are at least 57 extant plans in the last 60 or 70 years that have tried to deal with this issue, and none has attracted the kind of support from Israelis, Palestinians, and other stakeholders that suggests an outcome that is viable. What we're going to do today, therefore, is essentially three things. Number one, you're going to hear from Michael Bell, a very distinguished former ambassador representing Canada as ambassador in Jordan, Egypt, and Israel. And I had the opportunity when I was serving as United States ambassador to both Egypt and Israel to be there at the same time as Michael. And so we became not only colleagues, but very close friends. Ambassador Bell, who is now the Paul Martin Senior Scholar at the University of Windsor, has managed a most innovative project over the past couple of years, the Jerusalem Old City Initiative, which has brought Palestinians and Israelis together in an effort to see whether, from the perspective of stakeholders, there are ways to look at the problem of Jerusalem that may yield some possible results. We'll also hear from Marshall Berger, whom I'm sure all of you in this room know, a very long-standing public figure in Washington, a professor of law at the Columbus School of Law at Catholic University, who has written extensively not only on a range of issues, but particularly on issues relating to Jerusalem. And Marshall will address some of the religious sensitivities, religious issues, and the kinds of problems that need to be resolved in the sphere of religion as we move forward. And then the third set of issues that we'll talk about are those that kind of flow from these discussions. What do we need to do to make these things happen when negotiations start? To what extent will Jerusalem be an impediment to even the beginning of talks? Are there steps that need to be taken in advance of negotiations that create an atmosphere not only generally in the Arab-Israeli conflict, but specifically in Jerusalem that would make the talks that much more likely to succeed? As is the practice at the Center for American Progress, we will also have extensive time for questions and answers, and I think you all have cards at your seats. So when you do have questions, please write them down, and someone will come around to collect them, and then I will have the privilege of choosing those which I think would stimulate the most serious discussion. So I look forward to our afternoon, and I hope you do as well. I think we should start with Ambassador Michael Bell to describe the project and some of its conclusions.
Dan, I'm going to stand at the lectern if I can, because it's a little easier for me with the PowerPoint that I want to use in presenting this. And the key reason I want to use the PowerPoint is some of these elements are so graphic that images convey a sense of meaning that isn't necessarily apparent at first hand from oral discussion. So we'll give it a try here. Okay, that is a photo of Jerusalem with the Old City in the foreground. As I'm sure most, if not all of you know, it's less than 1 square kilometer in size, population of about 35 to 40,000 persons, most of them Palestinians, overwhelming majority of those being Muslim. And what gives it its great importance, however, is it is the center of three faiths, and we are confronting an issue here that involves much more Islam and Judaism, because the most holy site in Judaism and the third most holy site in Islam are one and the same edifice, as you will see. We started out, I and a group of friends, and I should say joined very quickly by Dan Kurtzer and Marshall, and in the audience Art Hughes from the former employee of the State Department and ambassador to Yemen, who has helped us greatly and continues to help us. Why did we pick Jerusalem? Well, it was certainly the most contentious issue in dispute. And it seemed to us that without resolution of that, even if one solved all the other issues at hand, peace would not be possible, because it went to the core of identity, the narrative of both Israelis and Palestinians, Jews and Muslims. And when we looked at it, we saw that previous approaches had been exclusionary. In other words, how do you divide Jerusalem? How do you divide the Old City? For instance, the Geneva Accord that Yossi Beilin, amongst others, brought to the fore was based on a plan where you had an Old City that was open, but certain streets were sovereign Israeli territory and other streets were sovereign Palestinian territory. And there would be a free flow until there was a crisis or an incident, and then the fence would be put up. And there would be an independent investigation going to a joint Israeli-Palestinian committee that would decide who was responsible and take the appropriate action. Well, I think for those of us that are familiar and have lived in the region for long periods of time, that one could conclude variously that such a situation of openness, given the substantial distrust that exists in the region, would last variously between 3 minutes and perhaps 3 weeks. So the problem with Geneva wasn't that it wasn't appealing intellectually. The problem with Geneva was that it was not sustainable in our view. So we took that as a very critical part of our approach. It had to work. And within that context, we would try to come up with an option or series of options that went as far as they possibly could to meet the needs of both parties. In other words, the emotional needs, historic needs, psychological needs, and what have you. And we would leave aside for the moment the question of sovereignty. In other words, you have a need to worship, for freedom of worship, to maintain your sites, etc. Were it not for the Haram al-Sharif, Dome of the Rock complex, of course, Jerusalem would not be as problematic as it is. And it's important to remember, those two entities are one and the same, in fact. So we tried to get away from the idea of sovereignty, territory, and political control, and rather to address inclusionary, deeply rooted, and authentic needs. Our methods: we tried to get a group of people together who were experts in various fields to do with demography, with law, with the political process. And we reached out to a good number of Palestinians and Israelis, but also to outsiders. The three Americans that are here today, I realize you're all Americans, but the three that I cited are really our American partners. We got a good amount of help from Canadians, including John de Chastelain, who was the Canadian ambassador to Washington, also chief of the defense staff in Canada, and still the chief arms decommissioner in Northern Ireland to look at security issues for us. So we went to look for as much expertise as we could get, that we could bring together in a series of meetings and discussions and papers. And we've commissioned, if you go on our website, you'll see almost 30 commissioned papers, mainly from the region, but also from authors here like Marshall in the United States and indeed in Britain. We tried to get people that were relatively like-minded, but we did not choose the necessarily easy targets. In other words, people that would be considered outside the mainstream of Israeli or Palestinian society. And I think we succeeded. In our last report on governance, there are about 50 names of individuals that collaborated with us in one way or another. Why now? Because one has to do this work before the negotiations start, as the Camp David process showed, I think. We were told by the Jerusalem Institute of Israel Studies, who've worked very closely with us in the past, that they got a call during Camp David in the middle of the night from the Israeli delegation saying, "We're talking about Jerusalem tomorrow. What do you think we should say?" So for all that is written about Jerusalem and all the detail and its history and claims and counterclaims, there really was precious little, in fact, almost nothing done on how to resolve the issue in a way that would meet the requirements of all parties. When we started, it was during the Second Intifada. People said, no, there's fighting going on, etc. No point in discussing it now. We managed to make the case successfully that now was the time of need. We were a bit skeptical about the Jerusalem Institute's claim to be the source of wisdom on Jerusalem even at the 11th hour, until I related this to Gilad Sher, who was the chief Israeli negotiator at Camp David, and Gilad said, well, it's perfectly true. We phoned in the middle of the night because we didn't really have much in the way of an idea as to how to proceed. So, what did we take as the framework? Two-state solution, two capitals in the Jerusalem conurbation, Jerusalem, the capital of Israel, Al-Quds, the capital of Palestine, and for the Old City, a special regime. In other words, the two-state solution and the two capitals separate the parties out from each other, whereas the special regime, in a sense, is inclusive. There is Jerusalem in the Old City, rather, in the greater Jerusalem area. You can still see, if you like, from the urban demography, where the old ceasefire line was and where the new Israeli settlements are in East Jerusalem. So, sustainable options, as I said, treating the Old City as a single unit under an administration with executive authority. Now, these are not ideas that we arrived at suddenly and we said, we have the solution. Some of the things here, perhaps we're slow learners, but literally took us years for the light to go on and to say, here is a viable option. And I'd be happy to discuss some of those things with you in the Q&A. But we felt that this kind of option, meeting this challenge, would ensure sustainability. There's a map of the Old City with the Haram al-Sharif Temple Mount in green and the various quarters marked. Most of the population is concentrated in the Muslim quarter, to a lesser extent in the Christian quarter, and the Jewish quarter and the Armenian quarter being relatively sparsely populated. In fact, population density in the Muslim quarter is some of the densest, most dense on Earth. There is the issue, the challenge, as you can see, the Dome of the Rock in the background, on the Haram Esplanade on the Temple Mount, below the retaining wall of that edifice, the western wall where the Jews pray. Sorry, just getting a bit mixed up here in terms of operating these things. I think I might be. I might be. Yes. No, the wrong slides have all been expunged from this presentation, Marshall. There is a graphic of the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif. This is a graphic of Muslims praying on the esplanade. One of Jews praying at the Western Wall. And the reason these images are important is they denote the identification of these believers with their own traditions, with their own calls as to their narrative, their sense of belonging, their sense of need. And these are things that are really so profound, I don't think that one can override these in any sense. In other words, I don't think a solution can be involved in saying, well, they'll just have to accept it. Because they won't just accept it. That these needs, although mainly psychological and emotional and what have you, are so strong that they will overcome many other more practical things that some negotiators might think are important. The old city encompasses all the aspects of the conflict we found: political, demographic, security, social, and religious. And again, I can't emphasize enough, overlapping sacred space, involving the national aspirations of Israelis and Palestinians and the sense of belonging for Muslims and Jews. And when these things are not handled appropriately, when the governance system is such that the needs of both parties are not being met, this is what you get. This is a photo taken during Ariel Sharon's walk on the Temple Mount, which preceded the outbreak of the Second Intifada. So we wanted binary governments and exclusive jurisdiction to be seen as unsustainable. As I said before, not enough trust, systemic mistrust, which will not dissipate immediately and may never dissipate, may well never dissipate. So the two parties do not, in our view, have the capability of managing any agreement that they might come to. In other words, they may well sit down on a piece of paper and come up with various scenarios. But how do you manage that in practice? Recognizing that if the Jerusalem provisions aren't sustainable, an entire peace agreement can easily fall apart, given that this is the root of identity in the old city. So we had the absence of trust, the proximity of the communities within the old city, the impracticability of divided authority, and the cultural integrity of the old city of Jerusalem. Now, a lot of people will say, well, if you divide it up and you have to put a fence up, fine. On the other hand, there are others who will say, no, we should not divide this historic entity, that it is a symbol for, in a sense, all peoples, and it shouldn't be divided like Berlin was. Now, the problem was, how do we deal with this in the sense of Israeli and Palestinian ownership? Because from time to time, people have said, well, you're just trying to institute the corpus separatum that the UN tried or the British wanted. And that is not the case. We want to see this. The whole series of ideas that we've developed are really on the table for Israelis and Palestinians to pick up on if they choose. And if we succeed in making them aware that this is a kind of fourth option for the old city, and they choose to ignore it, that's fine. Our objective is just to inculcate the possibility of action which might help resolve some of the issues. But it's clear that the Israelis and Palestinians have to be seen to own the process. We think it could work under a variety of sovereignty options. Frankly, I don't think there's going to be any agreement on sovereignty. And I think the easiest way to deal with that is not for either side to give up their claims to sovereignty, to maintain those claims exactly as they are today, but to say the implementation of those claims, so the assertion, if you like, of those claims, will instead take place following an agreement between the two parties, and in the meantime, a special administration will be set up. We, Palestinians and Israelis, agree to do this at least on an interim basis. And what that would do, if we're successful in setting up such a regime, would be to ensure dignity, human rights, and equity for all living in the old city, all visitors, all pilgrims. And we would, really what we see is a chief administrator who would be appointed by the two parties, Israelis and Palestinians, to administer the city, according to a mandate that those two parties would give the administrator, and to whom the administrator would be responsible, accountable. But that mandate would have to be sufficiently forthcoming for any chief administrator, again, appointed by the parties. The catch is there, they would have to agree to have the freedom to handle crises without interference from one side or the other. If there's rioting in the old city or a property grab or a massacre or what have you, when emotions will be inflamed and when it would be extremely difficult for the parties themselves to handle the situation. Lastly, premise of global importance and international support. Obviously, the old city won't be a self-financing institution, but and some say it would be, this option would be far too expensive, and it will be expensive for 35 or 40,000 people. But we're talking about far more than those people. We are talking about, as I say, the ideas that shape our universe and our own being and our own attitudes. So we have a treaty. Israel and Palestine agree. They are the prime members of a governance board, which will maintain ongoing. Now, Art Hughes tells me I cannot use the term oversight, because in the American context it has a very specific meaning. But to those of us from abroad, or north of the border, a continuing role in seeing that the chief administrator does his job or her job properly. And then a chief administrator, under which will be a police services, municipal services with planning, zoning, permits, services, utilities. In other words, there's some basic public services. You have to have a common utility system. On the other hand, what's really important here, planning, zoning, archaeology, excavation, and what have you, all the kind of cutting points or crossover points that Israelis and Palestinians are going to have in dealing with the governance of the city, in a way, at least on an interim basis, has to be put in the hands of someone that they both view as fair-minded. Courts and dispute resolutions, we have to deal with community, religious, and intergovernmental liaison. Obviously, that this regime would have a lot to do with the two municipalities and with the two governments in doing its job. Areas of friction, as I said, policing, heritage, archaeological oversight, access planning, zoning, equal status for all residents, religious freedoms, appropriate access to the holy places. Police service recruitment from abroad as agreed by the parties. Now, what I mean by that, and this is a good example of how it would be run in that interplay between the parties and the administration. People say, well, yes, we'll let the Norwegians, you're going to appoint Norwegian and have Nepalese troops run this. Well, it's not quite that simple. What we have considered is the idea that the Israelis and Palestinians together would agree on which countries were acceptable as a source of recruits for the police force, or perhaps for the entire administration. And that on that basis, in this case, the police service, the chief administrator and the chief of police would recruit individuals from those countries to serve in an old city police service. In other words, I wouldn't go to Ghana and say, give us 20 of your best. These people would be interviewed, they would be hired, they would be chosen by the administration according to their ability as individuals from countries specified by the two parties on the governance board. On the other hand, this regime is necessarily intrusive, but it should be no more intrusive than possible. And therefore, what we have concluded is that for functions that are exclusively affecting the nationals, Palestinians or Israelis, such as citizenship, education, family law, religious practice, that those functions should remain with national governments. In other words, if you're an Israeli citizen in the Old City, Israeli law applies to you affecting citizenship, education, law and practice. Family law, as I say, religious practice. And close cooperation with the surrounding municipalities and the two countries. So the administrator will have their mandate in the peace treaty. They would deal with functions essential to security and be responsible for the dignity of inhabitants and visitors. This question of dignity is very important for Palestinians. It comes up in our discussions, and we've had many over and over and over again. Security, I think I've talked about that. Single police service, stability, sustainability, respect for human rights, impartiality, accountability, a unified command, and coordination with Israelis and Palestinians. The gates. We had an architectural study done of the gates, specifically the Jaffa Gate, as to how one would control, if one needed to, exit and entry. I had a discussion with Dan Meridor on 2 occasions, and he said, well, look, this will never work. Exit and entry, how do you control that? I talked about new technologies, making this a relatively very speedy process. He said, well, you'll ruin the architectural unity, if you like, of the old city. If you do this, it can't be done. So we took the Jaffa Gate, and our architects came up with a plan that would allow the Jaffa Gate to open to vehicular and pedestrian traffic and security. I won't explain all of these given the interest of time, but I want to show you this. People entering the old city from the Israeli side could pass. If you see the lower picture on the right-hand side, there is a gate which, when necessary, when the old city chief administrator, chief of police believe that it's necessary, check for security reasons. That can be very easily integrated into that Jaffa Gate complex. If you look on the upper left-hand side, you see a photo of what is actually there now. So in fact, one could almost argue that this would enhance the architectural value of the old city. Holy sites, very important. Obviously, if it weren't for them, this idea would not be so critical. So the sanctity of holy sites and access to them is to the satisfaction of religious communities, subject to the requirements of public order. The Ottoman status quo, the modus vivendi, and customary practice are respected. And what's interesting here is that the Palestinians we're dealing with do not disagree with that. What they say is that often the modus vivendi and customary practice are interpreted to Israel's benefit at their cost, but they do not object to those terms being used as the guidelines for use by a special administration, special regime for governing holy places. An advisory religious council to provide advice on maintenance, access, archaeology, management, and ritual worship. We're not quite sure how meaningful this would be, simply because the various religions have not shown much capacity to work together. But in any event, the special regime could work with representatives of the given religions and sects. International advisory bodies on cultural heritage to be consulted. I'm told I'm out of time here. Legal framework, I'm sure Marshall will have things to say about that. That's just an image of how we consider it's a skeleton of what the special administration would look like, what its reporting relationships would be, and the various branches of governance that it would include. Political economy, we see a lot of benefit with embassies moving to Jerusalem, with a city that's open to much broader range of tourism, et cetera, et cetera. Conclusion, an equitable, sustainable framework for peace. That's it.
Okay. For those who, in addition to the question and answer, you can Google the Jerusalem Old City Initiative and get to the website and have access to all of the studies that have been done. Also, earlier this year in Foreign Affairs, Michael and I co-authored a piece that tried to incorporate these idea into about 5-6 pages. And I think you'll see reference to that in an upcoming issue of Middle East Progress on this subject. Having now taken the broader look at the issues, we're going to narrow the lens aperture, and Marshall Berger will focus in on the religious dimension of the Jerusalem issue.
Well, thank you. And I'll try to be short so we have still time for questions. First of all, I want to say that Ambassador Bell's discussion of the religious issues in Jerusalem is really unique, because in past diplomacy, there was very little attention given to religion. Indeed, it was considered a problem. Let's put it to the side. Let's ignore it. I mean, 2 examples, of course, when the Oslo Accords were signed on the White House lawn, there was no rabbi, no priest, no imam up front to buy into it, even by a blessing. The Camp David agreements, one of the participants suggested to me it was kind of Palestinian yuppies from Ramallah talking to Israeli yuppies from North Tel Aviv with American yuppies from McLean and Georgetown, basically saying, put religion aside, it's a problem. But of course, as Michael Bell has made very clear, if you talk about Jerusalem or the Middle East more generally, you can put religion aside. And what I'm going to try to do now is very, very briefly touch on what are the interests and concerns of the various religions in relation to Jerusalem, and then suggest at least a methodology by which we can address some of those problems. Whether we can solve them, I'm not so sure. If I was so sure, I'd have the Nobel Prize already. Not that that tells you much. A lot of the Nobel Prize winners haven't done very well. Now, let me start with the easiest group, which are the Christians. I say easiest because they have, so to speak, less skin in the game. Until the 4th century, Christianity viewed the land of Israel as intrinsically holy, but after the 4th century, they shifted to the view of a kind of spiritual holiness. Jerusalem was a spiritual ideal rather than an earthly, physical holy site. And indeed, when a pilgrim asked the Bishop of Jerusalem in the 4th century whether he could take some earth back to where he came from, somewhere in France, I believe, the bishop told him, no, throw it down on the ground, don't waste your time. That's not a kind of a holy item. But of course, we have to distinguish between religious doctrine and folk religion, because notwithstanding the Bishop of Jerusalem, certainly relics were brought back in abundance from the Holy Land, and it had a kind of talismanic and religious significance. And certainly the question of the ownership or control of religious sites became very important to the different religions in different branches of Christianity. That's one reason for the fight over who has control of more naves of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Because if you had control, that was a sign that your religious narrative was true. If you had ownership, that was taken as a sign of the truth of your religious narrative. I just read last week an extraordinarily interesting study of Jewish travel books during the Crusades and Jewish pilgrims. And they were painstakingly trying, when they would go to a site like the cave of the patriarchs in Hebron, to show or to claim that the site that the Christians said was where the patriarchs were buried, that wasn't really the place. It was someplace a little different, where only the Jews knew about. And similarly, the site of where the Christ was buried wasn't really the place. Because if it was really the place, that was a sign of ownership, that was a sign of the truth of the religious narrative. So notwithstanding the kind of theology and doctrine, religion, in the folk religion, the sociology of religion, has a lot of political power elements and concerns to it also. And one of our problems is, as much as we can, to separate out the politics of religion from the doctrine of religion. But now, notwithstanding that, the Christian view is that the land itself, the doctrinal view, is not intrinsically holy. The Christians have 5 concerns. First, they're interested in internal autonomy of the administration of the holy places. That's the basis of this Ottoman status quo that was referred to. These are a collection of firmans or proclamations by the different sultans, depending on whether they wanted to please the French, in which they say they'd issue a firman giving priority to the Latin Catholics, or whether they were trying to please the Russians, in which case they'd do a favor for the Greek church. These firmans reached international status in the Treaty of Berlin, and the British took them over, and they found some soldier who had gone to Cambridge and studied Greek, so they told him to codify them all. There's a guy called Lionel Cust, and he published holy places under the status quo. That became the kind of Bible of holy place law. Except, of course, he didn't have the actual Ottoman archives because they got vanished when the Ottomans retreated. So whenever one of the churches differed with their ruling, they produced something from their own archives. Internal autonomy. Second, access to holy sites. This is a big issue because the Israelis claim they protect access, and they do for tourists and for Israelis. But from the point of view of the churches, since a large proportion of the Christians in Israel or Palestine are in Palestine or across the Green Line, they can't get in to pray. So there is an access issue, and it's one that exercises the Christians and the Muslims a lot. The Israeli rationale is public order, security. I can't help but believe if the shoe was on the other foot, if there was a problem of Jews praying at the Western Wall, they'd figure out a way to deal with the security. And indeed, there have been a number of proposals collecting people in Bethlehem and checking them out there, taking them by bus to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. But these ideas have never turned into reality. Third, visas for clerics. Again, an aspect of religious freedom. There's a big problem of religious visas for priests, for ministers. There's a problem of their getting them renewed. The truth is, this is largely a problem in the Ministry of Interior, which has been in the traditionally controlled by Shas, which is an ultra-Orthodox, fervently Orthodox Sephardic party. They have a problem with non-Jews in the Holy Land, and therefore they're tough on visas for the Christians. Thirdly, the root of the wall, the fence, whichever you want to call it. In Jerusalem, it's 10 feet, so it's hard to not call it a wall. The wall cuts in the middle of a monastery from a church school from the people who go to the school, a church hospital from the people who go to the hospital. And this has been a big concern. The Catholics in particular have gotten various congressmen to complain, and since the way to impact on the Israelis is through Washington, when the congressmen complain, the root of the wall has been shifted, or in at least 2 or 3 cases, fences have been put in the wall to accommodate these religious concerns. And finally, the Catholics in particular want an international statute to protect religious rights in Jerusalem. This is a kind of fallout from the notion of internationalization of Jerusalem, the corpus separatum that Ambassador Bell referred to, an idea that kind of collapsed in 1950, partly because neither the Jordanians who had taken Eastern Jerusalem and the Israelis who had Western Jerusalem wanted to have anything to do with it, and the UN wasn't prepared to push it when the parties themselves, both parties, the Arabs too, were opposed to it. So the Vatican shifted to an international statute. It's more a reflection of the desire of the Vatican to have a recognition that Jerusalem is bigger than just Israel and Palestine, that there are more parties involved. Because in one sense, Israel has already accepted through different international instruments like the UN Human Rights Convention and others, just about everything that the Vatican wants in an international statute. So it's as much a kind of symbolic statement as a legal statement, but that is a point of continuing concern from the Christian point of view. The real problem, of course, is Islam and Judaism. In terms of Islam, the Haram al-Sharif, the farthest place, as it's referred to in the Quran, the place where Muhammad went on his night journey, on his way up to visit heaven and return, and conventionally viewed as the third holiest place in Islam, certainly one of the three places that is meritorious to make a pilgrimage. The first two, Mecca and Medina, you're required if you're able to. There's been a view by some Jews that since it's third, it's not that important to Islam. I think that's a silly argument. There is some truth that it was in periods when Jerusalem was not under Islamic rule, the Crusader period, the Mandate period, there was Israeli control. There was more discussion of it in the Muslim world, but the argument that it's not holy to Islam, I think, is a silly one. You have to accept a religion's definition of what is holy. The problem, of course, is what flows from that. At present, the view of the Muslim clerics is that non-Muslims should not go onto the Haram. This was not clearly always the view, because in the Mandate, the Waqf, the Islamic Religious Trust, charged admission and used it to raise money for Waqf repairs. Well, they weren't charging admission to the people going to pray. They were charging admission to the non-Muslims going up there to look. And there is evidence that before Jewish entry onto the Haram became a political issue, they were religious, kind of religious practice in earlier periods that allowed it. Now, this is, of course, a big issue because they will see from the Jewish point of view, it's the holiest place in Judaism, there's a desire among some to go up onto the Har HaBayit, onto the mountain of the Lord, you might say. There is an interesting fact that recently there's a report that the Palestinian Authority is prepared to give control, management, you might say, of the Haram to Muslim countries in a peace treaty, particularly Saudi, which views itself as the protector of the holy places, Morocco, because the King of Morocco is considered a descendant of the Prophet, and the King of Jordan also a descendant of the Prophet, and whose dynasty used to be the protector of the holy places. Now, I haven't had that report confirmed. If so, it's very interesting because it suggests that the PA is looking for buy-in of other Arab countries into any peace discussions. And in the past, this was something that they would never countenance when Jordan, which under the peace treaty with Israel has, quote-unquote, special interest in the holy places. When this treaty was signed, I have the words wrong, but that's the idea. When this treaty was signed, the PA went crazy, Arafat went crazy, and Jordan retreated and said, we're just holding the fort for the Palestinians, nothing more. So this suggestion is, I think, a significant one. Thank you. We all tend to overspeak. Let me jump to the Jewish concern again. Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount, the holiest place in Judaism, so holy that according to normative Judaism, Jews should not go up on it. And in fact, if you go to the entryway to the Temple Mount, there's a big sign, Isur, forbidden, from the chief rabbinate. I won't go into the technical reasons, but what's important is that this ban is being eroded by religious Jews. That is to say, religious Zionists are not, rabbis are less and less accepting the ban, and settler rabbis are less and less accepting the ban. And the number of religious rabbis who are going up to the Mount is growing, which of course is a tremendous problem in terms of settlement of this conflict, because when you had the view that, yes, it's holy to us, but we can't go on it, well, as a practical matter, it allows for management solutions. But if it's holy to us and we are going on it, big problem. Now, the Jews are going up, but according, the Temple Mount is managed by the Waqf, by the Muslims, and the Israelis have given the Muslims that management authority. Result, the Jews who go up want to pray. The Muslims won't let them pray, and the Israeli courts have accepted that. So the Jews have the right to go up. No one can know what they do in their heart, but if they begin to pray visibly, they carry the impertinences of prayer, a prayer shawl or whatever, they will be arrested and hustled out. One of the big issues is whether the Muslims would accept some form of Jewish prayer, Jewish synagogue, at some part of the Haram. Haram, you have to understand, is like a large field with the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, and a large field. Kids play Frisbee on it. So there is room in one sense. In another sense, from a religious point of view, I can't say if there's room or not. Now, let me jump quickly to how we deal with these. Seems to me that you have to think about three issues of holiness: the question of ownership, the question of exclusivity, the question of sovereignty. Three issues when it comes to holiness and the Temple Mount and holy places in Jerusalem: the question of ownership, the question of sovereignty, the question of exclusivity. Is it necessary, if it's holy to me, must I own it? Or simply have use of it? And of course, each religion will have its own view, but I suspect that there's a lot of examples where people have been satisfied with use and not ownership. Secondly, if I own it, must I have sovereignty? This, of course, brings in political questions into religious questions. And certainly at a time, the long period of time in Jewish history when there was no Jewish sovereignty, that was not a relevant issue. Some of the discussion of the necessity for sovereignty is partly a belief that if we don't have sovereignty, we won't have use. So we have to have sovereignty to have use. And secondly, a view of the some recreation of the Davidic monarchy as being relevant, if not to today's times, to bringing the Messianic age. Sovereignty. Third is exclusivity, perhaps the most difficult. If I own it, is it necessary for me to prevent you from having any use of it? And again, as I said before, to the extent to which ownership, exclusivity suggests that my narrative is correct and yours is wrong, it impacts on exclusivity. Certainly the history or examples in Israel of trying to share holy sites in recent years has not been very good. The Cave of Machpelah in Hebron is the best example, although I should say the Tomb of Samuel works out. And I should point out, historically, there were many examples of sharing holy sites between Muslims and Jews in the Maghreb, in Iraq, and even today in Iran, in Hamadan, the tomb of Esther and Mordecai, visited by both Muslims and Jews. I think the way in which we're going to have to deal with religion and Jerusalem, religion and the Israel-Palestine problem, is to have more analysis of these three questions: ownership, exclusivity, and sovereignty, and see if you can find some play, and I suspect you can, both doctrinally and in terms of the sociology of religion, in these three approaches. Thank you very much.
Thanks. As you jot down your questions and they make their way here, lest you think I'm a benevolent moderator, the sign for ending the presentations was a little hangman's noose, which both of our speakers got to see. Let me add two dimensions to our discussion. When we think about this issue in the current context of a pre-negotiation phase and influencing the possibility of getting to negotiations. Context number one is, are there possible red lines for us to consider, both with respect to the Old City in particular, but Jerusalem more broadly, that need to be looked at this phase in order for the right atmosphere to be created by red lines? One of them, obviously, is the question of extending any discussion of a settlements freeze, which is currently on the U.S. administration's agenda, to Jerusalem as well, an issue that has been highly politically sensitive over the years, as you know, and has very often caused its own kind of political crisis between the United States and Israel, let alone in the context of the peace process. This is a particularly relevant issue because of at least two ongoing activities in East Jerusalem, which run the risk not only of complicating the process of getting to negotiations, but perhaps foreclosing options in the negotiations. One of them is the so-called E1 project, which would link Jerusalem with Ma'ale Adumim to the east, and should it be successful in doing so, could end up bifurcating the West Bank and creating a problem for the contiguity of a Palestinian state in north-south terms. And the second question, which has been raised of late, is are the activities being undertaken in Silwan, which seem to be under the jurisdiction of settler groups, which have wrested control and administration of what normally would be Israeli government activities, and are now using that bully pulpit to move Arab population out of the Silwan neighborhood and to create an exclusive area for Jewish settlement and Jewish commercial and cultural activities. So these are not just theoretical issues in the run-up to negotiations, but they're very practical problems. A second kind of red line that we might talk about would be related to the whole issue of archaeology. When negotiations have taken place on Jerusalem, there has been discussion about mutual vetoes in which Palestinians and Israelis would be able to exercise some kind of an influence over the degree to which the other side would be able to conduct archaeological digs in areas that are sensitive religiously to the other side. Is this a point which needs to be inculcated into the negotiations even before there are negotiations in order to create that right kind of an atmosphere? This leads to a second set of issues, and with that I will look at my little hangman's noose and turn the floor over to you for Q&A. And that is, are there policy principles which might be thought about even in advance of negotiations which would help us get to a negotiated outcome, such as the idea of eschewing unilateralism as a means of determining the outcome in Jerusalem as well as elsewhere? In other words, ensconcing further, particularly on this critical issue of Jerusalem, the idea that only through negotiations and engagement and through the creative solutions that you've heard about today, can the parties reach an outcome, not through any unilateral actions by one or the other side. Second, particularly as Marshall indicated, is there a way to ensconce the idea that the religious, historical, cultural narratives of the respective parties get enshrined with an equal sense of understanding and importance, so that there isn't a competition to prove that a particular place or a particular shrine is exclusively the domain of one side, but rather the narrative of all sides proves that inclusiveness rather than exclusiveness can govern in Jerusalem. A third issue, which Michael started to talk about, is the importance of security. Now, we often hear this in the peace process context emanating from the Israeli side. It is equally important from the Palestinian side. Both sides need to know that an outcome in Jerusalem, as well as in the Arab-Israeli conflict generally, is going to provide for national and individual security. And that is certainly a principle that needs to be thought about in the Jerusalem context. And finally, I would suggest, at least for our thinking, is to look at patterns of life in civil society. Jerusalem is a vibrant city, and yet unless the vibrancy of the various communities, not just the large Palestinian Israeli definition of community, but digging down more deeply into the sub-communities within each nation, within each group, how can they be respected? How can long-standing patterns of life and contributions that have been made to the vitality and beauty of this city be preserved in order to provide, again, a better context for negotiations? So those are some issues to think about. Now give me 2 seconds to look at questions and see what we got here. We got a question on Hamas, which I'm actually going to skip. So I'm going to start, let's see. There's a question which is the subject of a whole different lecture, but maybe, Marshall, you can at least start us on it. What's the exact trace of the 67 Green Line through the Old City? In other words, is there a defined border behind which the parties might think about returning in the context of a settlement, or are we talking about a negotiated border in that?
I mean, there is a division of Jerusalem that is relatively clear, which on one side the Arabs live, on the other side the Jews live, except for some of these quote-unquote settler extensions, outposts. The Jews don't live on across that divide, and except for some very recent kind of land purchases in terms of the law of supply and demand, the Arabs don't live on the Jewish side. When this divide exactly follows the Green Line or not, I'm not sure. But there's certainly, when President Clinton surveyed the situation and suggested that in Jerusalem the Arab neighborhoods would be Arab, the Jewish neighborhoods would be Jewish, that line is still pretty much today as it was in 2000 when Clinton put forward the Clinton parameters. Now it's being eroded by the settler efforts, but it still, I think, clearly exists. You go on one side, you have Sheikh Jarrah, you have the American colony. You go on the other side, you have Mea Shearim, you have Geula. That's a divide that's continued.
Okay, 2 questions that probably, Michael, you might want to take a crack at. What is most objectionable about the status quo that would prompt us not to simply defer a solution indefinitely? In other words, leave it in God's hands. The idea of sovereignty belonging to God. And not related, but a quite different kind of question, how do utilities work currently and in the kind of scheme that you had suggested in the study?
Well, let me take the easiest one first. Perhaps we'll run out of time. in terms of utilities, clearly those utilities are now, in one way or another, being provided by Israel, sometimes indirectly through the East Jerusalem Electric Company, but basically they're being provided by Israel. I think what would happen is that there would have to be a fair degree of integration between Jerusalem, Al-Quds, and the Old City regime in terms of these services. If one were talking about the Old City regime itself, the idea would be, and a lot of this will have to be worked out, but if one were just talking in isolation, what one would do, we think, best do, is go out, get tenders. Who's going to pick the garbage up? So a company is retained to pick the garbage up. Who's going to supply the electricity? Who's going to do this or that? So that it's an example of, I guess, privatization. The Old City Special Administration would be responsible for those services in the Old City, but it would not directly deliver them. Rather, it would either independently or in conjunction with the two municipalities deliver them according to some kind of bidding process as exists in many parts of the world today. Now the tough one, Dan?
The tough one is, why not just defer the issue and say sovereignty belongs to God and we can't fix it?
The reason is that I don't think that you would find a sufficient majority, or any majority indeed, on either the Muslim or Jewish side, Israeli or Palestinian side, depending on how you want to define it, that will agree to defer their claims to sovereignty. So we thought of this kind of option ourselves, but we decided that it was intangible. It was sufficiently intangible that it would be more effective, and there's some legal precedents in Canada to do with self-governments for Indigenous peoples, whereby they claim that they have an effective sovereignty over certain territories in the north, and the agreement has that both sides, both the federal government and the community concerned, would defer their claims in the interest of continuing with the status quo and governing according to new agreements reached. Now, I think here it'd be much easier for both sides to say, you know, we'll temporarily, even if that temporary turns out to be largely permanent, we'll temporarily give up the exercise of sovereignty, so functions of sovereignty, or at least some of those functions, to an interim regime. But we maintain our claims. There's less to give up in terms of emotional, narrative, and other requirements, psychological, sociological requirements.
Well, look, the answer I think is very clear. Deferring is just a cop-out. First of all, as I said, the Jewish religious ban going up on the Temple Mount is eroding. To the extent to which it erodes, the problem of resolving the Temple Mount becomes exponentially greater. Secondly, you have continued Jewish settlement in the East Jerusalem, and as I said, today you could find those Clinton parameters still being real-life sociological division of the city. In 10 years it may not be, so the problem of resolving will become even greater. And the issue is really not the sovereignty, the issue is the management. And you can put, as you put it, let sovereignty belong to God if you want, but the problem is how you're going to arrange for the management.
I will in a moment call on members of the press, so you might want to identify yourself when I'm ready for that moment. But there are several questions, and I'll put them all together, that ask about how you deal with the reality of radicalization within the religious communities in Israel and Palestine for an idea that, you know, is rational but doesn't address the exclusive, totalist aims of, for example, Hamas or the religious element within the settler community. How do you address this issue in the context of the planning that went into the study? Maybe, Michael, you can start with that.
Well, in that case, you'll have to repeat the question.
The question was, you have a plan which seeks to find common ground, but you have radical religious communities growing up within the two constituencies. How does the plan relate to those?
Well, it's a very good question, and an important one. If I put on an historian's hat, which I'm not, I could very easily conclude that this confrontation in the region is insoluble. So we'll have a continuation, if you like, of the status quo with periodic outbursts of violence and what have you. As a person involved in the policy process and in the search for solutions, one has to be rather more optimistic in order to work to attain goals that one day might be feasible. Ultimately, I think, in face of this radicalism, on the Arab side, for instance, I think the whole idea that Marshall mentioned, if it's the case of involving the Saudis and the Jordanians in the management to give it a chapeau that goes simply beyond the Palestinians, if the Palestinians can accept that, it may well have merit. I think on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side, a lot depends on leadership. This won't be solved unless, frankly, you have the kind of leadership that is charismatic, that can pull people together. And I think Barak might have been able to do that when he was prime minister. He failed. Arafat might have been able to do that. He chose not to. But if we're trying to look at progress, it's going to be an overwhelming sense that this person represents us, the Palestinians and Marwan Barghouti or whoever it might be on the Israeli side, and that there's a consensus within society to move to restrain these radical groups. And it'll have to be played out in a very careful way. Obviously, there will be violence. I think violence on both sides. But I think what one has to anticipate is that people feel they're getting a fair deal or minimum justice, that their basic needs are going to be met, that this radicalization may cease to be a source of sustenance. It may lose its support base. I often think that, despite the fact that many Western countries are pouring money into the PA, I just read an article the other day that said that there, again, is a great shortfall in terms of salaries and what have you. Well, there has to be seen to be some benefit. The legitimacy, many people don't agree with me, of the Fatah and the PA has to be built up so that the moderate option is there. And the same in Israel. Some may view the present government as very stubborn, shall we say. On the other hand, if we look at the Israeli political perspective, as well as radical groups such as those represented by Mr. Lieberman and what have you, you have a lot of former Likudniks and centrists who are now in favor of a two-state solution, who are willing, in fact, whether they say so or not, to consider the division of Jerusalem. So I think there is realism, and I think that can be built on, but it requires very strong, committed leadership on both sides and the kind of imaginative idea that Marshall was just talking about.
Are those bold enough to identify yourself as members of the press? No one's so bold. Okay, let me go back to the questions that you all asked. There's a question that says...
I'm going to follow up for 1 second.
Sure.
There's a difference between, as I said, religious doctrine and sociology of religion. I'm talking about the Islamists and the settler fundamentalists. I was in a panel like this with Tariq Ramadan, in Rome in December, one of the leading European Muslims, the grandson of the founder of the Ikhwan. He's too dangerous to let into America. And he agreed that if his Muslim fear is being pushed out of the Temple Mount, if it's being Judaized, if that fear was gone because of a sense of a political solution, then they could solve the religious problem of sharing the Temple Mount. So from a doctrinal point of view. So you have to distinguish between the sociology of religion and the religious doctrine also.
There's a question about the manipulation of the religious issue by the respective parties. On the one side, some Israelis feel that Jerusalem's alleged holiness to Islam is being manipulated and exaggerated. We've heard on the Palestinian side skepticism that there really is a long historical tradition of Judaism in Jerusalem. In advance of even coming up with creative ideas, are there ways to begin to break down those barriers and to deal with those kinds of skepticisms? Marshall, you want to start?
Well, it's a big problem if people don't accept the religious narratives of the other. And I think that this kind of view, like of Daniel Pipes, that Jerusalem isn't that important to Islam, I mean, I don't know how he can say it because he's not an expert on Islamic doctrine. He may be making a political point, as I said, that during the most focus on Jerusalem was when Jerusalem was under control of a non-Muslim ruler. But from a religious point of view, I mean, he's not a stakeholder. He's not a commentator. On the problem of the historicity of the temple is bizarre. And part of it, I think, is from the Jewish point of view, is taken, of course, as a rejection of any Jewish stake in the Holy Land at all. Even the most secular Israelis were shocked. I have to say this on the kind of Arafat, I hate to be put in this situation, of Arafat's defense. There is a long kind of myth in Islam that the Queen of Sheba seduced Solomon, not vice versa, and that they went off to live in Saudi Arabia and built a big palace there. And if that's your mother's milk and you grew up on that myth, it's not so far from saying, well, that temple's somewhere's in Saudi, not in Jerusalem. But having said that, I can only tell you that if you read the publicity material of the Waqf itself in the 20s and 30s, back when I told you they was charging admission, they talk about the haram that the Dome of the Rock is based on the site of the temple. So the notion of this distinction is again the intrusion of politics into religion.
If I could add just one point here, I think it's very important to realize that these belief systems, whether they're historically valid or not, is way beside the point. Those belief systems are how people define themselves. So it's not up to me to tell you whether your narrative is valid or not. It's because whether I prove it, so to speak, is going to have very little effect, if any, or on your own belief system. In fact, it may just reinforce it. So I think we have to accept those belief systems as givens and deal with the reality of how we accommodate them, rather than try this kind of political, as Marshall says, one-upmanship, where we try to discredit the claims of one side to the other.
Maybe we'll make this the last question since we're running out of time. Michael, some people are interested to know what kind of reaction you've gotten to this when you've discussed it with government officials, both formally and informally, and whether you anticipate any changes in those reactions in view of the new government in Israel and its views on this issue.
Well, yes. I mean, I would say that this government has different views, this present Israeli government, than its predecessor. But we're deliberately trying to avoid making this a partisan issue in any sense whatsoever. What we're just saying is, if a decision is made that there has to be some agreed upon accommodation in the old city of Jerusalem, here are some ideas that would make it work. Now, if the parties both or separately decide that they don't want these, or there's not going to be an accommodation, or the Palestinians claim it's all ours and we're going to keep it, well, that's another matter. And in a way, it is our concern in an aspirational sense, but it is not our concern in terms of the validity or credibility or legitimacy of the plan. So what we're just trying to say, it's here if you want it, if you're not interested in it. We're trying to make it like such a part of the landscape that when people think of solutions to Jerusalem and the Old City, that this pops up as one option. And there may be a dozen others. So that's the limit of our ambition. Now, it would be awfully nice were it to go a bit further than that.
Well, on behalf of us, thank you for coming. On behalf of you, we want to thank the Center for American Progress, the Middle East Progress, and our panelists for what we hope was an informative and provocative discussion. Thanks.